Well, Hannah, let's talk a little bit about consumer producer surplus and what and what happens when a tariff is imposed. Consumer surplus is all of the additional gain that consumers or people who buy things receive when they purchase something below a price that they're willing to pay for it. And I've got a graph on here, and it said just a simple example that I'm using to illustrate these concepts. But if we look at it, it's the green area is the consumer surplus. There's a price of 24, and you're going to have some individuals, according to this graph, the demand curve is a downward sloping that goes above the consumer surplus. The demand curve shows willingness to pay at different prices and different quantities. And according to this demand curve, somebody's willing to pay 45 pesos or whatever type of unit currency this is. But the price is only 24. That means the difference between 45 and 24, that person gets 21 units of consumer surplus or additional benefit. If you go to quantity 10, we're looking at, what is that? That person's willing to pay, it looks like about 35. The price is 24. That means that person has 11 pesos of extra surplus that they paid lower than what their willingness to pay is. If you take all the individuals who purchase a 100-weight bag of rice, some people paid a lot less than they're willing to pay, some just at what they're willing to pay. You sum all those together, that gives us consumer surplus. And you can always find the consumer surplus below the demand curve, above the price, up to the quantity where the supply and demand curves intersect, where equilibrium is. So to calculate the area of consumer surplus, it's a triangle. You take 45 minus 24 in this case, and with that 40, that gives you the height of the triangle. The length of the triangle looks like it's 21. And so we have, what is that? 21 times 21. You multiply it together and it's 441. But because if you just take the height times the length, you're going to get a rectangle. And this is the half of a rectangle, it's a triangle. So you cut it in half. So the total consumer surplus for this case is 220.5. If we look at producer surplus, if you're thinking about the time when you sold something, you probably were willing to take a lower price than whatever it is you negotiated selling it for. And that's the amount of additional surplus. It's just like consumer surplus, except it has to do with the seller. In this case, somebody's willing to sell for, it looks like 3 pesos, but they got 24. That person is going to have 21 units of producer surplus. And then you sum up everybody who's selling stuff. To calculate the total area of producer surplus, it's the same thing as you do with consumer surplus, but with a seller. The consumer surplus is demand curve. We're talking about the producer or the seller. So that's why we want to look at the supply curve. Everything above the supply curve, up to the price, up to the quantity sold or the equilibrium, that will give us the total producer surplus. In this case, looks like we have 24 down to 3. That's the height of the triangle. So what is that, 21? And then you go from 0 all the way out to the equilibrium quantity, 21. 21 times 21 is 441. Again, like we're doing a triangle instead of a whole rectangle. And so we sum those two together. And that gives us total producer surplus of 220.5. And if you want to look at total economic surplus, total economic welfare, whatever you want to call it, you sum the consumer surplus and the producer surplus together. In this case, it's going to be 441 units. Let's go to what happens if you impose a tariff. In this case, there's a world price of, looks like it's 15 units. And so we go back, the 24 is the equilibrium quantity if they're in autarky when there's no trade. If products are cheaper to buy elsewhere, people will import them. And in this case, the price is $15. that changes things up a little bit. In the absence of any trade interference, how does consumer and producer surplus change? Recall that the consumer surplus is everything above the price, below the demand curve, up to the quantity purchased. And at a price of $15, consumers are willing to buy 30 units. So that's a lot more than the 20 units that they had in the absence of trade. At a price of $15, you'll have fewer sellers that are willing to sell things. $15 intersects a supply curve that looks like it's about 12 units. They're only willing to sell 12. So that gives us an excess demand of 30 minus 12 and of 18 units. That's a quantity. The excess demand is satisfied by importing those units of rice, and or whatever type of unit is being imported that we're talking about. To calculate the consumer surplus, we look at everything above the price of 15 up to, it looks like 45. So we have a height of 30 out to the number that are purchased. So that's 30. So 30 times 30 is 90. And again, we're doing everything below the demand curve, willingness to pay, above the price paid up to the quantity. That gives us 30 times 30 or 90. And we're doing a triangle, not a square. So you cut that in half. So the new consumer surplus is 450, which is a lot higher. That's in both the light and the dark green areas. What's the new producer surplus? Well, producers are selling 12 units. And so the length, I guess the width of the triangle is 12. What's the height? 15 minus 3, which is 12. So 12 times 12 is 144. Again, we're doing a triangle instead of a square. Everything above the supply curve, below the price that they receive, has an area of 72. And if you want to look at the total economic surplus, that's going to be, let's see, 522. What happens when we impose a tariff? You see if I've got, I don't have a slide for small country, but if we were to impose a tariff, say for example, of $5, with a tariff of $5, I'm going to draw a line right about here. It's not the perfect line. The red line that I just drew, that's the new tariff. With this new tariff, that's a new price that consumers pay is the difference between 15 and 20. They'll pay $5 per unit. That means they're paying 20. So the new consumer surplus is going to be 45 minus 20, which is going to be 25. And at this amount, they're buying 25. 25 times 25 is 625 for the new consumer surplus divided by 2. 312.5 is the new consumer surplus. Everything above the price that they pay. With this tariff, this area that I'm shading in, that was formerly consumer surplus that gets transferred over to the producer. If you want to calculate it, you calculate the area of this rectangle and add that to the area of this triangle, and that gives you the new amount of consumer surplus. Or the transfer of consumer surplus is now producer surplus. Producer surplus is 20 down to 3, that's 17. It looks like they're selling 17 units. 17 times 17, and then you divide that by 2. That's going to give you 144.5. So that's part of the total economic welfare. We have taxes in the amount of $5. And with this amount, we're going to be importing from right here to, let's see, 25. What is that? 17 to 25. We're going to be importing 8 units. 8 times 5 is going to be 40. This area right here that I'm filling in, units of 40, that's a tax revenue. So when you calculate the total economic surplus, you want to include the tax revenue. because the government's going to be collecting this as a tax. But it's still going back to society in the form of roads, ports, education, police, military, everything the government spends money on back to society. Therefore, it's not entirely a loss of economic surplus. The only part of economic surplus that's lost is a deadweight loss. And the deadweight loss is when you have, let's see, let me change the colors a little bit. Why don't I make it purple? The deadweight loss is, I can't see it very well. Is this area right here, which is no longer, used to be consumer surplus, now it's nothing. That's why it's deadweight loss. And this area right here, that's the portion lost to consumers, portion lost to the producer effect, because but both of those summed together gives you the total amount of deadweight loss that's no longer part of society. And if you calculate the area, where we calculating these? We're looking at triangles and squares, the basic geometry. We use that to calculate the areas of the change of total surplus. I hope this video helps and can help you understand how we calculate the social welfare in the presence of a tariff.